In this video, I'll walk through the character creation process for the Lord of the Rings role-playing. However, I'm going to attempt to recreate the same character that I first made for the One Ring. This will hopefully help to illustrate some of the differences between Lord of the Rings 5e and the One Ring. To avoid making this video overly complicated, I'm not going to be comparing the choices in Lord of the Rings 5e to the One Ring throughout. I'll just do that at the end. Before I start, let's take a look at some of the highlights of my original character. Elahir is an elven messenger. That should give him lots of reasons to be traveling out across Middle-earth. He has equal ratings in strength and wits and a slightly lower score for heart. Elahir is keen-eyed and swift, and his most notable skills are song, travel, courtesy, stealth, and lore. I'm a big fan of a spear and shield combo, so that is what he will primarily wield. However, he also has a bow. Oh, and before anyone mentions the weirdly low target numbers, when I made this character I used the alternate rules to start at 18 instead of 20, and then subtract the attribute rating from there. Anyway, let's get a new blank character sheet for Lord of the Rings role-playing and see how close I can get to Elahir version 1. It's also worth pointing out that if you want to be able to play Lord of the Rings 5e, you'll also need access to the D&D Player's Handbook. This first list of cultural traits is applied to all elves in Middle-earth. On page 35 there are some additional traits that apply to elves of Lindon specifically. The core book only includes one subculture, but more will be explored in future books. So, I can increase my wisdom score by 2. I'll lightly make a note of that here so I remember that when assigning attribute scores in a bit. Then I can assign a walking speed of 30. Now we get into some features that really set elves apart from other races. Elvish Dreams lets me gain the benefit of a long rest in half the normal time. Elven Skill lets me obtain magical successes when rolling for a skill that I get to add my proficiency bonus to, so long as I'm not miserable. Elves are also immune to aging and disease and have proficiency in perception rolls, which also aren't impacted by dim light. Looking at the subculture traits, I can increase my dexterity and intelligence scores by 1 each. Again, I'll just make a little note of that here for later. Elven Lore gives me proficiency in either nature, old lore, or performance. I will choose old lore for this, and I'll take a proficiency with a musical instrument. Lastly, I'll note down that my character is frugal, which gives me some additional starting gear and money, as noted on page 70. The last big element to choose from the culture is a background. I think for my character, the merchant family background will fit best. I'll mark down my additional skill proficiencies in persuasion and travel, tool proficiency with water vehicles, and my distinctive feature of fair-spoken and lordly. Distinctive features can gain inspiration when role-playing in accordance with those chosen features. That finishes up the cultural side of my character. Now it's almost time to move on to choosing a calling. However, I'm going to assign some ability scores now. For this example, I'm going to stick with the basic ability scores of 15, 14, 13, 12, 10, and 8, and assign them to my 6 abilities. I'll divide them up like this, so I'll have a 10 in strength, a 14 in dexterity, a 12 in constitution, 13 in intelligence, 8 in wisdom, and 15 in charisma. However, I have to modify these numbers by those earlier notes, from the cultural bonuses to wisdom and dexterity and intelligence. This changes those abilities to 10, 15, and 14 respectively. From these numbers I can get my base modifiers as well. Now we can choose a calling, which for Elahir will be Messenger. Let's mark down my starting proficiency bonus of +2 and hit dice of 1d8. This last one gives me my starting hit points of 8 plus my constitution modifier of +1 for a total of 9. I get some additional proficiencies in light armor, simple weapons, short swords, and swords, and a tool of my choice, which I'll set as Navigator's Tools. My key saving throws will be in dexterity and charisma, and I get to pick 4 new skills to add to my proficiency bonus as well. I'll go with Explore, Insight, Performance, and Stealth. I can now fill in all my skills and saving throw modifiers using the amount given by the base ability plus my proficiency bonus wherever that applies. Passive perception is equal to 10 plus your perception modifier. Now for some equipment. I'll take those navigator's tools that I have proficiency with and a spear, a short sword, and a bow, and 20 arrows. Remember to mark down how much weight you're carrying. If you are ever carrying a total weight that exceeds your strength score times 5, you will be encumbered, which, if I add up all my current gear, Elahir is already only 2 pounds away from being encumbered. I can fill out my attack bonuses, which are equal to my proficiency bonus plus my strength modifier for the spear and my dexterity modifier for the short sword and bow. The damage amounts are all listed with the weapons on page 73, but I can also add either my strength or dexterity modifiers depending on which ability was used for the attack. And then finally I'll write down what range the spear and bow can be used at. Next I'll make note of my shadow path of Wandering Madness, and gain a few final features. Folklore doubles my proficiency bonus for the old lore skill when recalling information about customs, beliefs, or stories of the various communities of the Free Peoples. This doesn't apply to all old lore rolls, so I won't fully adjust my skill modifier, but I will put a little star to remind myself about this ability. Tireless and Swift increases my speed by 5 feet when I'm not wearing heavy armor, and gives me a bonus to fatigue saving throws during a journey, And lastly, unarmored defense means my AC is equal to 10 plus my dexterity modifier and my charisma modifier for a total of 14. Not bad for a guy with no armor. Finally, to finish off, I can add my fellowship score and a patron. Your starting fellowship score is equal to the number of player heroes. However, this number might be further modified by certain virtues of your group or patrons. For this example, let's say my group has 3 players in it, so I'll set this to 3, then our patron will be Lindon, so that moves our fellowship score up to 4. Normally, fellowship points can be spent to gain advantages on ability checks, attack rolls, or saving throws. Lindon gives us a slightly different way to use them, by rolling an additional d20 on an ability check and choosing which result to use on our roll. There's a spot here to put in your heir. Off the start, you don't need to worry about this. This will come into play later in the game, if you want to raise an heir that can go adventuring after your current character retires or dies. That is Elahir done for the Lord of the Rings role-playing. However, before I compare the two versions, let's take a brief look at some of the options that he will get in the future. It's also worth noting that the highest level a character can reach in this game is 10. However, there are a few features that a player can gain if they want to keep playing a character past that level. Starting on level 2, I will get to make sneak attacks, and I'll be able to gain a virtue or a craft. Virtues provide permanent improvements to your abilities and skills, and there are common virtues that anyone can take, and cultural virtues that are specific to your character's heroic culture. Crafts are mainly used for the Scholar calling, and they work similar to spells in D&D, in that you will have craft slots that can be expended to use their effects. Crafts can allow you to speak to animals, improve equipment, or add some really interesting bonuses to certain skills. Starting at 3rd level, I can choose my Messenger Path, which is essentially the same as subclasses in D&D. The two Messenger Paths are Counselor and Herald. They both have some good options, but the Herald path will get me a little closer to my original idea, since I'll be able to get that shield that I want. And that's it. Elahir remade using the 5e system. So let's take a look at him side by side with his original. A big difference between the two is that my starting endurance in the One Ring is far higher than my hit points in 5e. However, the One Ring's combat can be really deadly, so these might kind of even out. Interestingly, I get an additional weapon in 5e but no armor. However, in the One Ring, Elahir gets both some light armor and a shield. The shield was something really important in my original character idea. I would need to wait until 3rd level to get a shield in Lord of the Rings roleplaying. I could of course pick one up earlier, however there are some serious disadvantages to using one since my character wouldn't have proficiency with shields until I chose the Herald Messenger path. And also, having a shield would cause me to lose my unarmored defense feature. That will still happen if I get a shield after I become a Herald, but at that point I could get some armor and maybe take the defensive fighting style to balance that out. Another difference between the systems is that spears aren't as powerful in the 5e rules, since combat doesn't have the same mechanics as the One Ring. However, it looks like the updated D&D rules has an additional sap mechanic for spears, which is nice. As far as skills go, my key skills in the One Ring are Song, Travel, Courtesy, Stealth, and Lore. In 5e, they are Explore, Insight, Performance, Persuasion, Stealth, and Travel. So your character is going to be more effective in the 5e rule set. With 5e, it's not much of a disadvantage to not have proficiency in a skill, or even to have a -1 or 2 modifier. However, in the One Ring, having a low rating in a skill can make your rolls very unlikely to succeed. Characters in the One Ring do get to start with 1 reward and virtue, whereas in 5e you'll have to wait until 2nd or 3rd level to get them. But then 5e starts with more equipment like weapons, instruments, and tools. It looks like the distinctive features in Lord of the Rings 5e are set by your background, whereas you can choose from a list in the One Ring. So I wasn't able to have the same features in this version, although the Tireless and Swift feature essentially works to incorporate my Swift distinctive feature that I took in the One Ring. So in the end, it looks like it's not a huge surprise that characters using the 5e rules are going to be a bit more effective than their One Ring counterparts. And off the start, at least as far as this character goes, I wasn't able to fully replicate him between systems. However, I feel that once you gain a few levels in Lord of the Rings roleplaying, you can get pretty close. So, while the systems are obviously different, it looks like the team at Free League has done a pretty good job of adjusting the rules from the One Ring to the Lord of the Rings roleplaying. So there you go. Hopefully you'll find this video helpful for making your first character and seeing how the two systems compare. If you are new to this channel, I'll mention that I have written a bunch of adventures that you can download. They all do use the One Ring system, so they're not going to be a perfect translation to the Lord of the Rings roleplaying. However, the general plotlines and NPCs should still all fit nicely into any campaign set in Middle-earth. If you'd like to check those out, I'll leave a link in the description. Thanks so much for watching, have a great day.